Okay, so today's lecture is on observations. And we're going to look at observations for practice and observations when used in research. We're going to focus a little bit more on practice, but definitely for research, so it's quite interesting to think about how we use that. And this sort of relates back. So some of the things we're going to be talking about, would be interesting for you to reflect on some of the things we've already studied and you've already learnt about. So constructs of childhood, those changes in society, the way we perceive children, and childhood, all that relates to, the things that will be talked about today, the role of the key person, attachment, play, all those things are interlinked. But we'll have, a little chat today and I'll introduce you to some of the things, but it's really nice that they are all linked as well. There is a chapter as well in the core textbook, which I haven't taken anything for this lecture from there, but in your core textbook, Powell and Smith, chapter 17 by Helen Moylett, Observing Children to Improve Practice. So you've got a lovely resource there as well. And don't forget on Leganto, there might be one or two that are just texts that are just focused on observation, but of course you'll find lots of information within those more general books and maybe edited books on early childhood. So have a look at at those as well. So you've got lots of really super resources, including the core textbook as well. With the reference list today, something that's new, but you be able to access quite a lot, but there is definitely a lot already there if you want to do some wider reading. So what is observation? So Collins Dictionary, observation is the action or process of carefully watching someone or something. And I think the important word in there is carefully as well. And that's what we're going to sort of hone into today, that word carefully. The use of senses. Absolutely, we use senses in our observations, don't we? Not just sight, hearing, and sometimes as well, taste and smell and things like this. The things we observe, if we think about what we do every day, what you're doing now, what you've done this morning, all involved observations as such, not formal, not planned, maybe not highly reflected on or thought about, but every day we are making observations, things we see, things we hear, things we smell, things we touch, so that's a sort of general overview. But as I say, that word carefully is what we're going to hone in on a little bit more today. So we're going to hone in on beyond observation in early childhood. Observation in research is beyond that we just look out the window and have a little look who's walking down the road, who's doing that, what's happening on the telly, what I'm reading. So we're going to move a little bit beyond that. But some interesting points there just to think about, everyday life, how does it differ from that? And the use of our senses as well. So why do we use them in early childhood? Well, for practice, absolutely. In practice, within EYFS, within Key Stage 1 and beyond, teachers will use observations, not as the main formal assessment mode, as that's EYFS, that where observations is the main sort of assessment. That's how we assess young children. But we still make observations, don't we, about our pupils, about the children we look after and that care about. So we still do that in different practice. So childminders, later key stages, what children do, what they say, is really important, and it's really important for practitioners to be aware, or caregivers to be aware of that as well. Yes, we use them for assessment very much, as I said, in the EYFS, as you then move through the key stages. So when you leave EYFS at the age of sort of 5, 6, go into Key Stage 1 in England, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3 senior school, they're not used so much for assessment, but they are still an important part of a teacher's pedagogical practice. For planning, absolutely. Where are children, where are children now? What are they doing? What do they already know? So those observations we've made, it's no good, doing something with a child that they already know, that they are already sort of solid in understanding or being able to do practically. So it's really important that we do assess and we do have a good understanding of children's learning and their development, and we move on from that and we build on that and we talk about prior knowledge. So important for that as well. For monitoring progress, so for example, in the EYFS, that's how, through observations, that's how you will monitor progress and state at the end of that year, at the end of the EYFS year, whichever one it is, what progress has that child made, at what sort of stage, what level, are they at? So we do look at it that way as well. Observations for targeted intervention. It might be that we have made an observation because of some of the observations made, then we feel a child or a group of children might need some more support, either one-to-one or small group targeted intervention, or it might be that we're doing the observations during those sessions as well. So again, that first one, the identification, really, that's in practice, monitoring progress. Are children, developing, learning at the level that is expected for that age group, and also for research. And for lots of different reasons, which we'll talk about later. We observe children, we observe what they're doing. And again, already during the course, you've seen clips, you've seen those sort of experimental tests, like, in relation to the field of psychology. We've looked at some of those, even thinking about attachment theory and things like that. So we've looked at research, research is really important to use observations as well. But again, not just in that sort of experimental test environment, but in many different ways. So the important part to consider, permission and consent. And this, of course, if you're in practice, then you are doing observations for practice, to inform learning, to inform planning. So it's part of your normal everyday practice. So where permission and consent comes in is when we're observing for research, when we are wanting a child to be involved in whatever way in our study or in some research. So this is where these implications, are really important, these ethical implications. And we're going to, this is linked to the Fargus Mallet reading as well, the article, isn't it, about consent, written or verbal consent, and by whom? Parents, teachers involved, children. Gatekeepers, we have to get permission. So if we're doing research and we want to undertake research in an environment, whether that's an educational setting, a social club, a play group, we have to ask permission through the gatekeeper, not just the teachers or the practitioners, but who is able to give authority to say, yes, you can undertake research at this setting. So that's really important as well. And another thing to consider is power relations, especially when working with children. I think we've had some of these discussions in sessions before. Children want to please, they often, want to agree, but it has to be really clear if we are engaging children in research that they are, aware of, their involvement, and they are able to, provide consent or assent in some way, and that, we consider from the child's perspective, the child's point of view, and we allow for permission, for their permission to be involved, and the understanding that if they want to leave and they want to move away and stop, then they are free to do so at any point as well. So quite a lot of things to think about. Power relations we are all impacted by power relations in our everyday, whether it's as a student, whether it's in any other job we have, or there's always power relations involved there, and it shouldn't be, should it, if we think about nowadays, shouldn't be that the adult knows knows best, and the adult makes the decision for the child. And that's how sort of society and thinking and research has moved on in time. But there's some really important things to consider, and again, we'll unpack those in a bit more detail. But we have to consider, those best interest, being open, being honest, making sure, all the information regarding any research we involve children in, they agree to that, and that we get permission to undertake research as well. For example, when you come to do your third year dissertation, you will go through the Liverpool Hope University, you will fill in an approval form, you'll fill in a form detailing, and you will get approval for your study. And you have to have approval whether you are involving children or adults, or you're just doing a literature-based desktop. You have to get permission from us, and then we use the BERA guidelines as well, which we'll talk about a bit more. So a lot to think about as regards to research. So types of observation, and there are broader and more sort of nuances within each of those, but we'll talk a little bit about some of these. So a structured observation. So in a way, quite a planned, organised, where the researcher will create, or researcher, we can talk about practitioner here as well, can't we? Practitioner creates a situation. So a situation is set up for a child to engage in, and you're going to observe that situation. So it's very structured, and it's very, and it's organised for that purpose. It could be semi-structured, so it could be that an area is set up, or that provision is made for a child, but then it's not quite as focused. There might be an aim. There could be an aim without a sort of very focused context, or it could be that there's a focused context, and then it's not sort of as structured. What's going on is not as structured. It could be focused or targeted, or a timed observation as well. And again, these could relate to research, and they can relate to practice. But doing an observation, it could be within a certain time period, focused on a child or a particular activity they're doing. And so say for example, you're working with young children, and you notice something one week during your general observations. You want to maybe make that a focus. So you're going to maybe observe that particular child, maybe for a time period, or maybe in a particular subject, or doing an activity. Or it might be that you just want to see, for example, how they move, because beyond thinking about learning, we're also thinking about development. So as practitioners, we have to be aware of physical, emotional, social interactions, and social development as well. And I've probably mentioned before, so in my practice, and everybody is the same, things like how a child moves, if you notice something, or are they moving, are they using their body weight, are they balancing, all these things we have to be aware of, and because that's part of our role, and part of those observations as well, not for learning necessarily, but development. It might be something we notice, as I say, during a session, so we need to keep an eye on that and focus, and maybe there might be some intervention or advice we need to take further than that. So naturalistic observation. So when we talk about naturalistic, and I'm going to unpack this in a little bit more detail as well, we're talking about something in more of a sort of an everyday setting, the child in a setting that's it's not a test experiment, it's not in a sort of child lab, it's not done for sort of these scientific purposes. It's more that they're in their environment, which may be a school setting, an education setting, a caregiving, because we're not just talking about school. It could be in the park, it could be, watching children in the outdoors, in their own garden, in their own house. So more of that sort of natural setting as well. And as I say, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And it could be a participant observation. So it might just not be that the researcher or the practitioner is observing and making notes, but keeping away from the the child or the group of children. It could be that they are participating, so they are engaging with the child or the children during the observation as well. So how to record observations? Well, lots of different ways. And I suppose technology has allowed us to do this in different ways, because written records can be time consuming, they can be lengthy. So allowing technology, photographs have been used widely and still are, and that's a way we can use. And often, especially in the early years, photographs are taken, put in maybe their learning journey or their learning journal or whatever it is that's being used, or uploaded, because rather than having a hard copy of evidence, observations of children and their learning and development, they're often done online as well, and parents can have access to those. So photographs are widely used, but also audio recording. So it might be based around the narrative, about the words. And of course, there are pros and cons to all of these, and it really depends on what the focus of the observation or the focus or the aim of the research is. And it could be filming as well. And again, what are the benefits of filming? Well, one of the benefits is you can go back over it and watch it again and analyse it. So in research, that would often be something that's used, and several of our staff members within early childhood have used that before, observing and recording, and then being able to go back and analyse that and discuss that in more detail. So filming, of course, what that means is somebody has to be there actually filming at that time, so that can take the person away. If you're talking about practice, but that is definitely something that's used. Photographs, yeah, as I say, audio and written records. And with written records, observations can be planned, they can be structured. You could have a focus, a purpose. Right, today I'm going to observe this group of children. I want to look at their next steps in learning, whatever it might be. It could be an incidental. It could be just that you happen to be sitting there. Maybe you're sitting with another child, or you're doing some reading, or you're tidying something away and you hear something or you see something. So it could just be that in the moment, incidental, which are still really important parts of practice as well. But written records could be detailed. Often in practice, they will use maybe a pro forma, especially if they're looking for something particular, or it could be a post-it note. Loads of post-it notes, but they're really important. Post-it notes, those little incidental things are really important, and they're still an important record to keep. Okay, so in practice. So as I said before, they might be used for planning, because also we're always interested in children's interest as well, aren't we? So not only what they're interested in, and we've talked about culture before, haven't we, in the context and what they bring, and their home life, and that's really important as well to embrace and encourage and encompass within early years. But also we might use them, as I say, for assessment, or to determine a special educational need, or and like I said before, that example where we might see something that makes us want more focus, or it might be that we have to get somebody else in. So for example, speech and language therapist, or a physiotherapist, and that might lead to child psychologist, or something like that as well. And that does happen quite regularly as well. If we feel something is happening or not happening, then what can we do about that, and what are the next steps for us in regards to that. So these observations in practice, to see what the children are learning, so what they're learning and how they learn. And again, how does that link to the theory you've already considered? Lev Vygotsky, Jean Piaget, thinking about these stages of development, thinking about how children learn, thinking about the context as well, the social context, where it is these observations are taking place, are all really important. And both of these inform planning, because they can look at next steps. They can identify groups of children, and maybe they have to do some targeted work with different groups of children depending on what they've observed. So really important part of practice. So Mason has done some really interesting work, and what I've done, in case you can't access this, if you're interested in this, and this is more from the practitioner's point of view, and it's got phenomenological underpinnings, undertones, because he's very interested in the lived experience of the practitioner, or of the person, of the adult, shall we say. And he refers to it as this art of just noticing. But actually, that's quite a brief and sort of, oh, it's just noticing. But like I said before, there's much more to it. So if you're interested in, I've put a chapter that you can get online through Google quite easily. If you're interested in having a look about, into his work that he's been doing sort of since the 70s, do take a little look at that. But yes, it's easy to say just noticing, but it is much more beyond that, and Mason talks about that in more detail. But yeah, it is just noticing, but it's how we notice, in what detail, how we do it, and what we do about it as well. But he also focuses very much on the adult's practice. So he sees this noticing, this paradigm, as a method for researching one's own practice, focused on the individual, so the individual undertaking that. And he's very concerned, as I say, this is where phenomenology comes into it. It's all about the lived experience of the person, and reflection. So if you're interested in reflection on practice, reflexivity, then it's a really interesting one to read, and about knowing oneself and how we can move on. And that's really important. And although this might be a little bit more sort of theoretical or philosophical than some of the other work on observation, it's still really important, because it's really important for the development of the practitioner. We should be moving on. We should be learning. We should be reviewing our own practice, and things should not be static. We should also think about ourselves and our own practice, our own, pedagogy, and considering as well our own beliefs, our own experiences, because what we do, how we are as a practitioner, is impacted by our experiences, our upbringing, influences on our life. So it's something that's really quite interesting, and although it's slightly different from practitioner observation, it's more really focused on the individual, the adult, and their practice. It's still really interesting, because, as I say, we need to be moving on. We need to be developing, and we should always be reflecting on our own practice. So the naturalistic observation, so this is where we're observing behaviour in the environment in which it typically occurs, a more natural environment, or as most as we can. So maybe it could well be a school playground, it could be a child's home, it could be a play area. But it has that more sort of natural environment to it. And as Dunn says, it allows for authenticity, or real life as it is. No agenda. The child, it relates to play, I suppose, a little bit as well, doesn't it, here? What is the child interested in? What does the child do? How does the child take their learning? We might have a focus of that observation. We might be looking for something in particular, how a child engages with equipment, or other adults, or animals, whatever it might be. But there won't be that agenda for the child. So we can look and we can observe in this more sort of natural, authentic way. And going back to the point which has been made, as I say, in several lectures on several themes, but about the social and cultural context, and that's important to consider as well. And this chapter by Tudgen and Hogan sort of talks about that a bit more, and very much relates to Lev Vygotsky, who's very much about the social interaction and the context. His early work. This is not something that's new. Theorists, people have been talking about this for decades. Well, centuries really, because you also have looked at some of the early childhood pioneers who talk about society, the social context, cultural context as well. And they go on to talk about how this sort of maybe more natural observation occurs in situations that mean relationships, and the context is transactional. So there's this relation, isn't there? There's relational, the interaction. How does the child or the children interact with their environment as well. That's an important consideration to consider as well. And again, I think we've introduced Barbara Rogoff's work before, but again, really important when we think about analysis as well, and particularly linked to naturalistic observations. So thinking about the child, the child themselves, the child with others, and then, the child with their environment and culture. So, thinking about that in a little bit more detail and having that as a consideration when we are observing children as well. What is the context, and the cultural dimension within that as well. So thinking about that in more detail as well. And often a lot of research uses Rogoff's these planes of analysis to analyse work they've done and research they've done with children and adults, but children, that's our focus. So observations in research, so it can be a method. Observations is a method, isn't it? How am I going to find this information out? I want to know about what type of toys a child plays with, or how many times they interact with a friend, or how many times they use the library, whatever it might be. It can be a method. That's how you gather your data, by using observations. But also it can be used for sort of field notes, for gathering information and for setting the context as well. So observations of the environment as well. And of course you don't even have to observe children. You can observe context. You can review play areas, and not necessarily one that's made for that function, but different areas and the value of play. So there's lots of ways in observation can be made. You're not always looking at the child and how they engage with the environment. It might be just, your research is an exploration of play areas for children, or the quality, or whatever it might be, whatever the focus is. So there's different ways in which we can use observations. And what do we observe? Well, absolutely sort of everything really. And there's no way. You might be having some ideas now, thinking about, what we can observe. Behaviour, and that links to, a lot of the work we've done on development as well, isn't it? Disposition, because personality in the self comes into early childhood research. A lot as well, but it is, that it is really important, like I said before, to know the children. So if we're practitioners or caregivers, and we're working with young children, we need to know those children. We need to know their character. We need to know their likes and dislikes, and have that, awareness of culture and personality. It's really important. And emotions, we can observe emotions, and when we talked about emotional development, sometimes it's very clear what a child's emotion is and how they're feeling, but sometimes we will not have a clue. We can't always tell through a child's actions or their body language, their non-verbal communication, how they're feeling. But there are many clues that, we can find that out, but not always. A child who's upset will not necessarily show that, might not cry, might not be withdrawn. And that's where, the professionalism really comes into it as well. But of course, sometimes their emotions are quite clearly visible. What do we observe? Learning, absolutely. Knowledge and understanding, skills. What skills? And this is where it's really important to have that knowledge, to build on those and move it forward and extend. We're not going to ask a child to keep repeating the same thing. If they can do that, right, what can they do next? Well, how can they do that differently? What's going to extend them? Not just doing bigger numbers, so, they can count from 1 to 10. They know those, they use them. Let's go to 20. No, how can we use those? How can they apply that knowledge they have in lots of different ways? So that's, that's important, especially in maths. And there's lots of research on observations in children and in maths. In fact, I think Mason's work that we talked about before, that art of noticing, is very much focused on maths learning and maths understanding, and asking questions, how we solve them. So that's some quite interesting work there. We can observe social interaction. We know the importance of social interaction, and we can definitely look at how often, in what ways they interact with others as well. Is it with other children, with peers, or is it with adults? relationships. So a friend of mine is their doctorate is on sort of looking at, maybe I should be able to say it in one sentence, but from when I spoke to him, it is on, there is often in a group, when you're with a child, a class or a group, there is often a child who is maybe or demonstrates behaviors of sort of a leader, maybe that sort of born leader, that leadership skills, and probably links to power and control. So some really interesting research there as well, because I can reflect on that, and you might reflect on your own experiences. Can you reflect on that as well? Do you think there was always somebody who was, people wanted to be with, was the leader who would organize? So some really interesting, work as well. And that links to quite a few of those, doesn't it? Behavior, disposition, emotions, learning as well, but social interaction, relationships, the environment. So, one piece of research can incorporate lots of these things as well. The environment, so we can, as I said before, we can look at the child engaging with the environment, or we can just look at the environment and observe the environment itself. Lots of research on that, and contextual environment as well. So, we can look at that in different ways. Is it a small area within a setting, within a classroom? Is it a big area? Are we looking at just open spaces in general? Are we looking at schools in general? So again, quite a broad range. And if you were doing research, you would have that focus quite clear in your communication. So lots of ways, lots of things we can observe. I think this is important to consider as well. So subjectivity, if we think about us observing, are we ever free of our own thoughts, our own beliefs, the value we put on different things? So that's important to consider, and we are human, and I think it's, we know it happens and it's acceptable, but don't hide that, be aware. And again, in research as well, whenever we do research, we know we bring things. Myself as a teacher, you bring experiences, you bring things you value. Everybody has their own beliefs and values, so it's just being aware of that and being open to that, and being aware of the subjectivity of observations, aiming for objectivity. That's interesting as well, thinking about that, isn't it? Can we just write about what we see without putting our own subjective thoughts, on there as well, and confirming the subjectivity as well, and verification. So just be aware that it is something that does it take time to get used to that, and can we ever achieve total objectivity in observations? So there's a clip there that you can have a little look at, as regards to just covering some of the points that have been made in the lecture so far. So just a couple of points to reflect on, but there may well be more. There might have been some things that have been brought up. I think the importance in early childhood of observations is written about everywhere. Undoubtedly it is a key method, it is a key concept, and there are, as many different ways of observing. There are several sort of theoretical frameworks, considering that we talked about Barbara Rogoff before, but we have also talked about Uri Bronfenbrenner and the ecological systems, which draws on similarities, but also differences, but also thinking about Vygotsky's work, Piaget's work. There are different theoretical underpinnings to this as well, and philosophical as well, a bit like Mason's work. But it is beyond everyday practice. It's beyond everyday noticing. And Mason, although he says it's just noticing, when you read his work, it's more than that, but it's interesting. So it is beyond just, oh yeah, they've done that. Why have they done that? How have they done that? What could they do before? Is it new? What are we going to do next? So all these things really important. And it is a purposeful learning tool, but there needs to be quality there as well. And there is training. So if you're working with young children, there will be, training. Will it come naturally? Yes, some things will, but there, often there are sort of frameworks. There might be pro formas and training and thinking about observation and observing children maybe in a different way than before as well. And this is not just education. There are different observations you might make depending on what your role might be in early childhood, in the field of early childhood as well. It might not just be in education. You might play a role, elsewhere. I mentioned speech and language, occupational health, all these things really important. And if you were in practice, say for example as a teacher, you would engage with them as well. So it's really important making those observations and discussing those with other adults as well. It should be rigorous, and it can be time consuming. So going back to the point earlier on, it can be time consuming if you're sitting in a classroom or in an educational setting or a caregiving setting, because we have to be careful not just to always talk about education, especially with very young children. That's really important as well. But also in research as well, if we think about taking, we talked about doing videos, that's a way we can go back, because if we were observation and taking notes, would we miss things as we're writing them down? Can we remember that note we made in that observation? Can we remember what that child was doing at the time if we don't have an image or the video? So, it can be time consuming as well. But often, worthwhile. But so it's getting the balance as well, and the awareness that there's a range of approaches here, as well. And it depends on the need, it depends on the aim, and it depends on the objective, and it depends whether and maybe the age of the child as well. So you might, there's some demographic information there to get as well, isn't there? Gender of the child, age of the child, and they may well come into it for how long you observe for, what you observe, but also in research, as well. You might be looking in research at a certain demographic, a certain age of child, certain gender. You might be looking, differences, boys and girls, interactions. So there's lots of different things as well you can consider there. But as you can see, we touched on quite a few things, but there's still quite a few things to consider in regards to observation. But quality, professional learning, professional understanding, professional knowledge, that it is beyond just what we do every day. But it, done well, it is a purposeful learning tool for us to be able to really think about children's learning and their development.